Paul, you've written a whole book about camp. Where's James Bond in it?
I was dreading you asking me that question, David. He is mentioned three times in the book, although in passing, I have to admit. So I don't have a whole section on him. And I do say in the book early on that I can't mention every single camp thing that ever existed, and I hope that if I've missed your favorite thing, we can still be friends. So I hope we can still be friends.
Yeah,
Um,
we
but
can
I
be
should
friends. I
explain.
mean, you did mention Mae Weston, Timothy Dalton playing opposite each other or with each other or whatever the hell was going on in that film Sextet from
Okay.
1978, which I only watched about a year ago myself, and I don't think I'll ever forget the experience. You mentioned Shirley Bassey. Obviously, you have to mention Shirley Bassey
Yes,
with Camp and Austin Powers, which is kind of obviously related. You did also mention, I've just remembered, you also mentioned cocktails being
I
inherently
did.
camp, which is a big part of Bond. So actually, I was lying. I had come prepared. So
Oh, that is
I did.
lovely.
In my
I like the
orange,
umbrella.
it's only an orange squash because we're recording this in the afternoon. It's not a Cointreau or anything more exciting. But I did bring a cocktail umbrella for those people watching the video version of this. So yeah, I'm delighted to have with me today Paul Baker, who is the author of this amazing book. And if you've not picked it up yet, I really urge everyone to do it. It's called Camp! Exclamation points. The story of the attitude that conquered the world. And if you've read any other of Paul's books, you may have heard of. He's written lots and lots of books, but he's written the ones that probably have been most widely read by a general audience, a kind of not necessarily academic audience. He's written a book called Fabulosa: The Story of Polari, which is I've written a teensy bit about Polari myself as a fellow linguist. I've been interested in that, and as soon as you say secret codes of gay men, I'm like all over it, writing a James Bond blog and everything else. And you've also written a book called Outrageous: The Story of Section 28 in Britain's Battle for LGBT Education. So as someone who works in schools, that I absolutely raced through that book. And I love your books, Paul, because what they are is, although they're incredible, they are obviously really well researched, really academic, but they're so accessible and also so funny. And I'm really grateful that you've managed to find some time today to talk to me about your latest book in relation to James Bond.
Thank you so much. You're my ideal reader, really. I think I should just I should talk to you about my next one, maybe get some ideas off you what you like to see next.
Well, a whole book on James Bond and camp would be great. Thank you. Yeah, no.
Consider it done.
Yeah, so yeah, actually, I do have half a degree in linguistics, so I apologize in advance. The others in literature, the other English discipline, and obviously I'm gay and an educator, and yeah, so I think I tick most of your boxes as ideal reader. And this is probably the reason why every one of your books, all three of those books, I've read in 2 to 3 days maximum, which you probably don't want to hear because all the time it took you to write those books, and then I always think that must be really frustrating.
I know I've had that a lot of people saying I couldn't put it down. I read it all in one night. I just kept on having to read it, which is sort of good because it's it's not a chore to read those books as well. But yeah, it's maybe it's like a big bar of chocolate that you just can't put down once you've picked up. I think that's that's
That
why I
that
view them.
That's exactly it, I think. This topic of your latest book, Camp, is something really dear to my heart. When I started what I do online with Bond about 3.5 years ago, one of the things that I wanted to look at in some detail was camp and James Bond, because I'll be honest, I was getting really fed up with people referring to James Bond as camp and also using the word campy, and we'll get into the distinction of that in a minute. But for me, what they were describing as camp and campy wasn't what I thought was camp. And I know there's a lot
Mm,
of kind of the eye of the beholder here, and some people find certain things camp and other people don't, and so on and so forth. But the biggest barrier that I faced when I wrote my piece about camp about 2 years ago was defining what camp actually meant. So I kind of wimped out and said, if you want to try and understand what camp is, here are loads of examples from James Bond films. So I did it through examples. So, and I know we're going to talk. So perhaps if we start with examples, and then I'm going to put you on the spot and say, have a go at explaining what
Oh.
camp is. So if you were to, if I think of camp, and James Bond in particular, I can't help thinking of. If you're watching the video of this, I am wearing blue toweling today for a reason, because the scene which screams camp to me is that bit at the start of Goldfinger where Sean Connery's supposedly around a pool in Miami, but it's really a back projected scene somewhere, probably on a freezing soundstage in London, and he's wearing a terry toweling romper suit. This is not a romper. I know you can't see below my waist, but trust me, this is not a romper suit.
What a shame.
It is just the polo shirt. I do know a couple of people who've got the romper suit. I'm not going to say whether or not I think they can pull it off. I'm not sure even Sean Connery pulls off a blue romper suit, to be perfectly frank. But for me, because perhaps it's so artificial, that scene, and it's kind of, what the heck is he wearing? For me, that scene just screams, and it's supposed to be kind of luxurious, but it's not. It's a bit naff, to use a Polari word. It just screams camp for me. So that's the first thing that I think of when I think of camp. What's the first thing that you think of?
For the James Bond films?
No, from anything.
From anything. Oh, it's a kind of sincerity that fails, I guess. So it fails at being what it's meant to be, and it ends up being funny without people who created it or liked it realizing that it's funny. So I think in the book, for example, I talk about toilet roll holders, and my nana used to have one when I was a child, and it was a doll, and the toilet hole bit used to go underneath the doll's dress, and then sort of that kind of made the dress shape, and she used to have it on top of her toilet. And even though I was about 6 years old, I always found that hilariously camp, that she had that, and it was sort of seen as like pretty, and it was hiding this toilet roll which was meant to be, you know, kind of an embarrassing thing, but you're in a toilet anyway, aren't you? So it's like, you know, kind of,
yeah,
the horse is bolted by that point. But the fact it's a little doll, like on the top, you can't even use it as a proper doll. But yeah. So for me, that is kind of camp. Anything artificial is camp, and so it's like a doll in itself is camp anyway, because it's not a real thing. But then when you have it disguised as a toilet roll holder, then it's sort of double camp. So yeah.
That example works for me. It's a shame you couldn't get a photograph of that for the book, because your book has so many brilliant examples of things that perhaps I hadn't considered with camp before. There are obviously some things that kind of scream camp to you, like I'm really into Noel Coward, for instance, and the film Brief Encounter. I've written things about those because they sort of have tangential Bond connections to them. So those things have always struck me as being camp. But there are lots of things that, as I was reading your book, I actually spent, although I read your book really quickly, I also spent quite a lot of time putting the book down for a second, watching something on YouTube, like episodes of Dynasty. There's one of my frequent collaborators, Sam Rogers. He really loves that kind of soap opera, and he's always sharing those clips with me as well. And I really kind of must get around to watching it properly, I think. But even clips of what were back in the day, celebrity chefs really kind of losing their patience with people.
Fanny Craddock, yes.
Yeah, Fanny Craddock, who I'd heard of but never dared watch a clip on YouTube about. And I was actually, my husband wasn't very happy with you, because I was screaming with laughter several nights as he was trying to get to sleep, as I was reading your descriptions of some of these things. So thank you for introducing me to even more artifacts.
Fanny Craddock would make a great Bond villain, I think. Actually, she was wasted there, but there's definitely inspiration, maybe for a future Bond. A character like her could definitely be in it, I think.
If you have no idea what we're talking about, you owe it to yourself to type in Fanny Craddock and go on YouTube and spend a few minutes and then come back here. Honestly, it will be a life-changing experience for you. Perhaps they're overstated, teensy bit. But you did, and you acknowledged this very early in your book, in terms of overstating things. You said the story of the attitude that conquered the world, and you said you might have kind of gone a little bit overboard there. But why do you think camp is so important?
I think it's a way of looking at the world, which I suppose, particularly if you're from a kind of oppressed or minority identity, gives you a way of kind of reworking things. It gives you an attitude to deal and cope with having that kind of oppressed or minority identity, and that you can kind of sometimes laugh at the oppression, and laugh at the mainstream and the stuff that's trying to oppress you. and kind of be outside it and possibly even above it as well. So I think for me, it's always been quite a good coping strategy, even from a very early age when I was at school. And I talk about in the book right at the start how I was kind of one of those boys who was always picked last for football, and how humiliating that always was. It's kind of a real kind of assault on your masculinity when you're
Yeah.
9 years old and you're last, and all the other boys think you're the worst at football. And then I had a friend who was similar to me. He was always picked last too. So we'd always kind of hang out together on the football pitch, right on the far reaches, and sort of make fun of everybody else. And that was kind of our way of dealing with being like the worst at football.
It's funny you say your friend Ian showed you the power of camp. I had
Yes.
very similar experiences to you playing. I invented my own game of try to avoid the ball rather than playing football or rugby at school. I didn't have a friend called Ian to show me the power of camp, unless you count Ian Fleming, because I was a Bond fan from about the age of 6.
Wow.
I had to go reading a Bond novel when I was about 8, which of course blew my mind and also went completely over my head at the same time. Especially all the kind of sexual content and everything else. But yeah, in a sense, Ian Fleming introduced me to the power of camp as well. So we've both got friends called Ian who kind of showed us the way, or provided some kind of escape from a world that we felt we couldn't really connect to. And is it kind of true that a lot of, I think sometimes, I sometimes do find myself saying the cinema being one of the few people actually laughing hilariously at something that probably isn't supposed to be funny. So is it supposed, I am that annoying person. Is it kind of true for you as well, that you kind of feel like a lot of people aren't getting that this is supposed to be funny, or maybe it's not supposed to be funny, but I'm finding it funny? Do you get that a lot?
I do. Yeah, definitely with Bond. I think I have certain relatives in my family, older relatives, who love it for what it is, I guess, on a kind of very, they just love the action adventure of it, and they think Bond's brilliant, and they just love it for that. And then I suppose there's me and my husband and others in the family, maybe younger members, and we love it as well, just as much as them, possibly more. But we kind of love it on other levels, and
Yes.
one is to kind of enjoy the kind of, there's an intentional camp in it, I guess,
Yeah.
and an unintentional camp in it, and then you can kind of watch it and be quite snarky and make fun of it, particularly sometimes when it doesn't always pull off what it's trying to achieve. Maybe that those kind of failures, which are kind of really at the heart of what camp is anyway, the kind of the failure of sincerity. So yeah, I think you can love it on many levels, I think, and laugh at it too, and that just makes it more enjoyable.
I agree. There are some parts of Bond films which are like, how is anyone taking this remotely seriously? And they're not the things everyone expects. Like a lot of Roger Moore movies, they're actually the kind of ones that are supposed to be more serious, but I find them funny. So we're going to get into our Bond examples pretty soon, because I know you've done quite a lot of research ahead of this. You've rewatched at least 4 James Bond films. Now that's dedication, Paul. I'm really impressed.
But I did. Well, I just been on a holiday to Devon and Burr Islands. It was a driving holiday, and the whole thing was we would stop over at different places each night, different hotels on the way down from Lancaster. And I was going to have a week of watching Merchant Ivory films, and I kind of had all those kind of prepared and ready. And then you invited me for the podcast, so I switched over to Bond. So I watched.
Wow.
I watched You Only Live Twice, Diamonds Are Forever, Honor Her Majesty's Secret Service, and Octopussy.
Okay.
Yeah, and I also watched Live and Let Die at Easter as well in Nice with my family. I showed it so we could have a bit of a kind of snarky watch as well. So I've kind of got 5 in my head, very sort of like, which I've made notes on and things.
Wow. Okay, that's really impressive. I'm especially impressed that you did. Was it You Only Live Twice, On Her Majesty's and Diamonds Forever, which were actually released consecutively? But you think about how randomly different those films are from each other.
So different.
It's
definitely
mind-boggling, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I for my notes for Her Majesty's Secret Service, I don't have a lot to say. I thought it was actually quite a serious film. I mean, it's kind of camp because it's Bond, but the other ones seemed to sort of had a wealth of notes. I was sort of stopping the film every 5 seconds to kind of write something down. But with On Her Majesty's Secret Service, it was just more of an impression of the whole thing being camp as opposed to certain lines and things.
So let's go through some examples in a second. If you had to try and pin down I couldn't help but noticing we've kind of ended up kind of moving away from trying to define camp, which is what happened when I wrote my article about it as well. It's like, I don't really want to pin it down. But if you had to, I actually had the experience after I wrote my article of going on a German podcast, which funnily enough, I'm not going to try the name of the German podcast. The really lovely guys hosting that podcast. And of course they did the podcast in English for that episode because my German is non-existent, but the podcast translated as "In Her Majesty's Ear Canal."
Oh,
Which I'm sure it sounds more poetic in German, but I was invited onto that podcast to try and explain what camp was. So I know how difficult this is, but you're going to find this a breeze. You've written the book. So go for it, Paul. What's camp?
okay. So I had this in chapter 1 of the book, and I was like, how do I define it? And then I read lots of different people's essays and things on camp, and everyone said something different, and some people were not very helpful, and some people had very, very long length or lengthy kind of things, lots of examples, but not a lot of kind of content there. So I kind of got it down to 4 ingredients that kept coming up again and again, and people seem to kind of agree on. So these are kind of my ingredients were things that are kind of over the top or excessive, I think. So too much, I guess, is one thing. Then we've got artificiality, so something which is not what it's supposed to be. It's pretending to be something else, so it's fake in some way. Then I've got acting against type, so something which is trying to be something but doesn't pull it off in some way. And gender often comes in there quite a lot, particularly with Bond. And then the last one is silliness, so just something which is sort of childish or flippant or kind of silly, non-serious, trivial, kind of frivolous in some way as well. So I'd say those are the ingredients. You don't have to have all 4 of them, but you have to have some of them at least, some to a greater or lesser extent. And then you've got this issue of whether or not it's intentional or not. If it's intentional, it's probably best called campy, and that's more than an American word.
Yes.
Coming about in the 60s or so. Whereas camp in itself is the thing where it's meant to be serious. It's sometimes meant to be very beautiful or high art in some way, but it just doesn't pull it off because of those other aspects of it, and then it becomes camp. But it's in the eye of the beholder. So what I see camp, you might not.
Yes, and that's crucial, isn't it? So some of these examples we're going to look at with Bond, people will be like, I don't get why that's supposed to be camp, but we'll state our cases anyway, and we even might disagree with some of our examples.
Yeah, and that's okay.
And I'm sure there are things you've noticed in the films which I've never considered to be camp, but we'll see as we go through. I mean, what you were just saying about the difference between camp and campy, for me, a lot of people, when I was growing up, and I used to read the descriptions in the newspapers of, you know, the films, the Bond film that was going to be on Bank Holiday Monday, and they used to write things like Octopussy, campy James Bond adventure, but they never used those words with the Sean Connery movie. Well, they might have used it with Diamonds Forever, maybe Only Live Twice, but not the early ones. Whereas actually, when I actually bothered to sit down and try and figure out what camp actually was, and read Susan Sontag's brilliant notes on camp, which is what I riffed on for my article, I came to the conclusion, and I don't know if you agree with this, but the kind of earlier Connery films lend them to, I know you haven't rewatched those ones recently, but those films actually kind of fit the description of camp better than the Roger Moore movies, a lot of them, because the Roger Moore movies are trying to be silly in a way. So in Octopussy, you have him dressed as in a gorilla suit, checking his watch before, you know, and I'm just like, there's no way you can possibly take this silly.
He's an alligator at one point, isn't he? He's disguised as a crocodile or an alligator.
That film is obsessed with animals, because the director, John Glenn, bless him, he loves animals. So he just tried to get as many animals into that film as possible. So that's why Bond ends up dressing up as so many creatures in that film and encountering so many creatures. Yeah, so for me, that's kind of, if you need to understand the difference between camp and campy, if ever I try to kind of think what the difference is myself, and you said intentional, I don't think the Connery films were trying to be camp.
Funny,
why you're right. They are.
But they are, yeah, because they're all extremely excessive and kind of silly, and Bond himself is camp. I mean, he's this exaggerated version of masculinity. He's too masculine. He's and also he goes against type. I mean, most men aren't meant to be looked at, or they certainly weren't meant to be looked at and sort of objects of sexual desire in the 60s. and Bond is. I mean,
Yeah.
basically, it's kind of, if I have an idea of a spy in my head, it would be sort of a kind of an almost like an invisible man, a grey man, a
Mm,
man that you wouldn't
mm.
notice in the street. You wouldn't give him a second look. So we could get away with killing people and doing all those things. Whereas Bond is always gorgeous. And so
Yeah.
whenever he goes into a room, everyone stares at him and wants to be him and wants to get to know him and sleep with him and stuff like that. And that's the worst quality if you're going to be a spy, to be so kind of on show and then wear all these clothes as well all the time. So that for me is kind of one of the camper aspects of it, the fact that he's so good looking, and he's so sexualized as well. He's always got his top off, every film.
And incredibly short shorts. I mean,
Yes.
people think a short inseam is a Daniel Craig innovation. Anyone
Oh.
who's watched Thunderball, I'm just like that. It's practically pornographic in places. It's like, Sean, really? And all those shots I love. You've just met. I love when he's checking into. It happens in Doctor No. He checks into the hotel and the receptionist, who's always female, it has to be said. So we don't get the gay gaze going on here. Although obviously in terms of the audience, a presumed straight male gaze, obviously is erroneous. But the female receptionists always look after as he leaves.
Yeah.
So they're checking him out from behind as he
Yeah.
leaves the reception desk. You're absolutely right. He's so conspicuous. All the hotel concierges know his name and which suite he has. He's the world's worst secret agent. So I think that's why he's quite camp.
I guess the only good thing about him being handsome is that he can seduce people, he can seduce women
Yes.
and get their secrets and things like that. So I can see why. But I think probably most spies you'd want them to be kind of anonymous, wouldn't you? So they're not noticed. And yeah, so that for me it makes it incredibly camp. And then you've got the women, they're all exaggerated femininity as well. They're all kind of over the top with big hair, and then the kind of clothes and the body shape, and then the glamorous locations. He's always, every few minutes he seems to be going to a different part of the world, and they're all kind of these exotic holiday locations, maybe that most people, particularly in the 60s and 70s, wouldn't ever get the chance to go to. They're very colourful films as well. The colours are really kind of maybe not so much the later ones, but the early ones are like kind of looking at a children's colouring book almost. Very vibrant colours. I'm colourblind, and even I can notice. I like them because they got such strong colours.
Right. Wow.
Otherwise, a lot of films I watch are just like watching black and white films, not the Bonds. And the music's so dramatic as well. The kind of the full orchestra that you get, and the songs themselves are just amazing. The credits are just over the top too. It's just all too much, I think.
Yeah.
The film is too much in a different way.
I think it is the too muchness out of all the four things. So let me remember. It was too muchness, essentially, artificiality, people acting against type
and silly.
and silliness. I think out of all of those, I think Bond is the too muchness. I think that's probably the thing that's most common across the whole Bond series.
Yeah, and I think at different eras or different Bonds, you get maybe some of the others coming in. So the Roger Moore ones, I think, probably are sillier.
Yeah.
Maybe than some of the other ones as well. And it kind of almost like childishness to the silliness as well, because children can watch them. And you said you were watching them when you were quite young, and children can engage with these films, and children can play Bond as well outside, and I used to do that as a child as well.
That's what I was doing instead of playing football.
You were playing Bond.
Yeah. I mean, we've got the artificiality. Some of that is due to the filmmaking constraints at the time. So I already mentioned about back projection, which is spoofed in the Austin Powers movies.
Yes.
As it was just so, because obviously it was so expensive to shoot on location. But what's really strange? There's been and I think part of it is due to COVID restrictions. There's been an increase in really naff back projection in films, or the modern equivalent green screen, blue screen. We've had so much of that in the last couple of years, particularly in the Marvel series, which they carried on making throughout. And I'm just like, it's kind of almost like a sort of kitsch return to unintentionally to the 60s. So I find a lot of those things unintentionally camp.
You can do it on Zoom as well, and on Teams you can do your own back projection now, can't you? And I've been caught out by that, saying to somebody, "Oh, I love your kitchen," and they're like, "It's just a back projection."
Yeah.
So that's come back. The nighttime filter as well. There was one of the ones I was watching with a very extended ski chase, and it all seemed to be filmed in nighttime filter, and you can see shadows on the ground as well, which doesn't happen at night time. So
Oh,
that
of
again is one of those
course.
things which is
You know what? I've never
really
noticed
great.
that. That was on a Majesty's then. Yeah.
I think it was, yeah, it was the Majesty's one. And then the stuntmen as well. Obviously, he can't obviously do all of his stunts, I guess. Although maybe he does some of them. And every time I like listen to the kind of commentary or the little documentaries on the DVDs, I always tell you about the poor stuntmen and how one had his leg missing or died, and
You only
or
live
something like
twice.
that.
Yeah.
And yeah, there was a guy in Live and Let Die who had to run across that little
Mm,
pond full of alligators, and
yeah.
he got bitten to bits, I think, as well.
Mm,
So,
mm.
yeah, I do feel sorry for the stuntmen on that on the Bond films, really.
Is Live and Let Die the Bond film that you thought? I think it was the Bond film when I first mentioned doing this. You thought of the film first, and I think Live and Let Die has so many camp qualities. What really stood out for you?
Definitely, I think it was the one I kind of watched at Easter and showed my nephews and nieces on holiday. So I
Yeah,
thought it's kind of the most accessible and silliest of the lot as well.
yeah.
I just love it. I love everything about it. I love the theme music and all of the kind of voodoo tropes and stuff, and
Mm.
the bits where he's in that kind of bar and then the table keeps vanishing or kind of disappearing in different ways. Wonderful, wonderful.
And that sort of silliness was really creeping in. It really is Diamonds Are Forever, which is the sort of the watershed moment. For there are elements of You Only Live Twice, but then the Bond series is strange. It goes through these, in terms of silliness, it goes through kind of peaks and troughs. So it's like every time it goes to, sometimes I use the phrase, it goes full Moonraker. So Bond goes to space in 1979, complete with disco version of the theme tune over the end. I always think they should have used the disco version over the opening titles, because
Yes,
that song is a bit boring, to be honest.
it is.
It's
Yeah, it's
not
one of the
it's
poor
not
ones.
enough, is it? Whereas the
No,
disco version is brilliant. I mean, leaving aside the fact that disco only had about a month left of its lifespan. But then after Moonraker, they go back to For Your Eyes Only, which, apart from dropping a bald-headed guy in a wheelchair, which doesn't play particularly well nowadays, bald-headed guy in a wheelchair down a chimney in the opening titles, which is more about trying to get rid of Blofeld so no one else can use him. That film is actually plays it straight until
mm,
a parrot chats up Margaret Thatcher in the final scene.
yeah, that's it then.
But
Yeah.
for the most part, it kind of does, and then it kind of, the silliness comes back in, and then it goes again, and then like in 2002 you had Die Another Day, and then they rebooted with Daniel Craig. So the
Mm.
silliness comes in peaks and troughs
In
through the
waves,
series.
yeah. And the Bond films have always tried to kind of reflect what's going on in society at
Yeah,
different times as well. So you do get sometimes where kind of it fashions are more camp and outrageous, and then times when things are more serious. I think we're in kind of a serious, for the last 20 years or
yeah,
so. I think things have been a lot more serious, and fashions have been
definitely.
a lot more muted, and colors more muted
Mm,
than they used to be. And I think also there's probably so much more awareness of camp now
yes.
that they can't get away with maybe what they could as in the past. Too many people would be in on the joke, and then the joke stops being funny in some way. Um, but I
Mm,
think Bond will always be kind of essentially camp, even if they try to give him, I suppose, like emotional backstories and dramas and kind of character development. I think the kind of the essence of camp is always still going to be there because it's about this kind of spy who's very British and dresses in tuxedos and drinks martinis and all of those things. You can't get away from that premise, which is camp in itself, no matter how serious you make it.
so many of those things are so affected, aren't they? Especially because, Bond's 70 years old this year. Casino Royale was published 70 years ago, and the fact that um he's going around the world drinking martinis, which is a very retro drink. That's probably the only. Can anyone order a martini in a bar without the bartender thinking, are they trying to be James Bond?
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, some his references are increasingly dated. I mean, you even see that in some of the earlier films. I think which is
Yeah.
the one set in the casino where he's wearing like a white tuxedo, and
Oh,
that's
Diamonds Are
kind of
Forever.
that's like 1971. But
Yeah.
he's not really leaning into the 1970s fashions.
No.
He's still kind of about a decade
Yeah.
beyond, earlier than everybody else in it, and that makes him look a bit out of time and that's that kind of failure. Again, he's sort of out of place there. And then in some of the ones, sort of the actors are quite old. I think is it Octopussy Roger Moore's 55?
Something 54, I think. Yeah,
Yeah,
54, 55. Yeah.
I mean, that's older than me, and to do all those stunts and things, and I'm thinking like he's going to break a hip, and the fact that he's still so gorgeous and attractive to every woman who looks at him and everything, and it's like, well, maybe they all have, I don't know, daddy fantasies or something, but
It's
getting
unlikely that
a
they
bit
all
much.
have daddy fantasies.
He's still a good-looking guy, but
Yeah.
it is kind of increasing the kind of preposterousness of it. I guess.
It is sad in a sense that we could never perhaps have that sort of thing again. As you said, I found it interesting that you said we're almost kind of in on the joke now, but
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
not
it's like we're
sure.
post camp almost.
Yeah. So are we post camp? Are we kind of past the peak?
I, th- I think they're still campy and but possibly even post campy now. I guess, and that there's fewer people who don't recognize it. I
Mm.
mean, something like the Barbie film, for example, that came out this year,
Mm.
is very camp, but it knows it is, and it's
Yeah.
playing with. It's also got a
Yeah.
very serious side to it as well. So I always feel that camp things now are just so complicated to write about,
Yeah.
to understand, and you need all of these kind of referencing and kind of technical terminology to kind of make sense of it in a way that you didn't in maybe 40 years ago when it was just straightforwardly camp and fun and wasn't anything other than itself. But now
And
everything's so clever,
mm,
which is
and then
not.
again, I'm just trying to think. I've just been thinking as you've been talking about. I don't. Did you see the last one, No Time to Die? You've got
Yes, I
a
did.
character in that called Paloma, who's only in one sequence, played by Ana de Armas. I think she's incredibly camp in the best possible way because she's an agent who's had 3 weeks of training. She's kind of like an ingenue, really. And I know there's kind of a character trope of like a Mary Sue, which I don't, I
Yeah,
take kind of commentary on that you empower women by not by just kind of making them brilliant at everything. But I love that character because yeah, she's had 3 weeks of training. One of the people who writes for my website says that who identifies as demisexual says that they find Paloma to actually be quite asexually coded, which I think is
uh,
interesting because when she first meets Bond, she doesn't. He gets the wrong. Reads the signals wrong. It's like no, you're taking your clothes off to get changed. I'm not going to sleep with you. What are you doing? But so it's almost like that's very tongue-in-cheek, obviously, because we know Bond's pedigree, and if it was in a Roger Moore movie, they'd sleep together and then go out.
yeah,
But then she's wearing the most kind of delicately, I think it's made of this crepe black dress, but she's also double wielding handguns. So she's subverting norms, which is one of your 4 criteria for camp. And I think that's probably why a lot of people love that character, because we've got this person who's not trained, but he's very capable.
mm,
She's a woman doing stereotypically masculine
yeah,
things. She's doing them better than most of the men.
yeah, definitely. And I think it's not just Bond who you can sort of read as camp in these films. There's a lot of
Yeah,
female characters. I mean, I'm thinking of, is it oh, is it Elsa Klebb or Rosa Klebb? The
Rosa
Lottie Lenya
Klebb.
character,
Yeah,
Rosa Klebb, and then Irma Blunt as well,
yeah.
on Her Majesty's Secret Service, and they're kind of both coded as,
They're both queer coded. Yeah,
yeah, kind of quite masculine women, possibly lesbian kind of
yeah,
characters, and in a way for me it shows that it's not just gay men who can be camp. Kind of I think lesbians can be kind of camp as
yeah.
well. And
We've missed
obviously
out Pussy
they're
Galore,
very much
obviously.
they're not they're not going to find him attractive, obviously,
No.
if they're that kind of woman, and so his powers won't work in that way on them, seduction. Um, and then you've got Mr. Wind and Mr. Kidd, those
Yeah,
kind of
diamonds. Yeah,
characters in Diamonds Are Forever, a very strange kind of pair of
just a bit.
characters. I'd forgotten about them. Then I kind of reacquainted myself a few days ago with them, and they're quite fun, I think, in a way. The bit where they kind of walk off holding hands, and then it's kind of they're obviously gay, but they're kind of weird. They're not just like gay, but they're like strange.
So we
Um,
could end up doing a whole podcast about Winton Kid. I've written about 5 articles about them myself, and I've talked to interviewers about them lots and lots. But I mean, my take on Winton Kid is that they are a horrendous representation of gay men. The fact that the BBFC re-rated Diamonds Are Forever, mostly some of the sexual violence, but mostly because of the stereotypical portrayal of gay people. So they actually upped the certificate on the film on DVD a few years ago. But they are horrendously stereotypical in some ways, just plain weird in lots of other ways. and the very final scene, he's like so
Yes,
uncomfortably
it
homophobic,
is. It
where
is. Yeah.
essentially he gets a bomb rammed up his backside and enjoys it. So
Yes, yes,
I
and there's a
mean,
little squeak of pleasure or pain, and ends up being thrown over by
and
Bond.
you know,
Yeah,
I
it's
mean, I can't think what 8-year-old me thought of that when I watched it for the first time, with a growing awareness that I was gay, and thinking, I'm not sure I quite understood exactly what was going on, but I knew it was kind of an attack on people like me. But for me, I still kind of take Winton Kid as being a sort of positive representation, because they sort of do hold hands and they love each other. But so I'm not even sure I'd put Winton Kid to me in the camp category, because I think I've probably thought too much about them and I take them too seriously. I don't know. What about you?
they're almost like kind of written by somebody who didn't know any gay people, but
Yes.
kind of had heard about them from some probably
Yes.
third hand, and
Yes.
then wanted to make something camp. That's two characters camp, and then that's what
Mm.
they could come up with. I mean, there's a wonderful line by Bond where he says one of us smells like a tart's handkerchief,
Handkerchief.
which is offensive on so many levels anyway.
No.
Just,
Just offend everyone.
all at once, yeah.
Yeah.
And he's referring to that, like kind of one of them's wearing an aftershave or something, I think. And then he smells it, and then he recognizes them later on, and realizes it's the clue, isn't it? That the smell of the
But for
aftershave.
me, that's the most
But
camp element. It's not Winton Kid. It's the fact that Bond recognizes them by their
the
aftershave.
aftershave, yeah.
And I mean, leaving aside the fact that how do you break a perfume bottle by putting a body on it? You know, it's and that's very. I mean, that's always annoyed me in that film. How do you break a anyway? It's but the fact that Bond recognizes perfumes everywhere he goes, that that's a very stereotypical gay trait. I mean, I'll be honest,
Yes,
I'll confess, I'm rubbish at spotting perfumes and scents, so I don't know where that stereotype comes from, but it's certainly not what you would kind of put in the, if you were to do two columns and go gay men, straight men, you'd probably put it in the gay men column.
you
um
definitely would. Yeah,
yeah.
I think so. Yeah, yeah. I'm the same. I'm allergic to like a lot of scents and perfumes, so I just start sneezing. No, if somebody puts it on, I have to open the door.
But it's so typical of Bond's fussiness about everything. And I know a lot, this has been highlighted quite a lot, about the exact way he likes his martini shaken and all that kind of, it's all very kind of, yeah, it's just very, very fussy, isn't it?
It is. There's a bit, one of the Daniel Craig ones, I think maybe the first one, Casino Royale, where he checked into some hotel and like it's not good enough, and he kind of
Yeah.
immediately leaves and books them all into like a nicer one.
He has a right hissy fit, and then
Yeah.
says Gemma Arterton's character says that this is blown our cover, and he says, "I've made a new cover. We're teachers on
Yes.
sabbatical, and we've just won the lottery." I'm dying to use that line if I ever check into a hotel that luxurious. I'm a teacher. I'm on holiday. I've just won the lottery.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of class thing I think going on possibly with
Mm,
Camp and Bond as well, in that he's obviously, for me, for someone like me who's from a working class background,
mm.
Bond kind of comes across as quite aspirational, possibly
Yeah.
went to public school. He's very clubbable. I'm sure he'd fit in all the Pall Mall
Mhm.
clubs and things like that. And MO5 is all kind of wood paneled room. It looks like a club in itself. And then you've got Q, who's even more upper class, I think, than Bond is.
This
And
is what
then
I
there's
find fascinating about the difference between the books and the films. And I don't think Bond is much less camp in the books. In a lot of what we've talked about applies there, but Bond in the books is very much an outsider pretending to be an insider. Whereas there's actually explicit passages where Fleming says he feels really uncomfortable in a club environment. In the novel Moonraker, for instance, that's probably where it's most explicitly stated. Whereas on film, you can't show that as easily because you
no,
can't get inside Bond's head. So it almost is like he effortlessly moves through these upper class worlds, even though he himself is not upper class.
is not. Maybe more with Sean Connery, you get that impression because Sean Connery was not from that world
No.
initially as well. But someone like Roger Moore just feels
Yeah.
like he fits in with that world so much. And I
Yeah.
think with that kind of upper class masculinity, there's a kind of maybe a featness,
Mm-hmm.
and the
Mm-hmm.
knowledge of the good wines and the cocktails, and almost maybe an otherworldliness as well, where they're kind of the ordinary concerns of people like mortgages and bills don't matter to them, but they're just jetting off to another location as well.
Mm.
And his voice is just so, I mean, it's not kind of the poshest voice, I think, but it's very kind of received pronunciation. It's always very steady and self-assured as well. And particularly when he's in danger.
Mm.
And he never reacts with an emotion. It's just maybe to make a little ironic quip or something about his situation, a little commentary on it. But again, that only serves to show how unflappable he is and kind of beyond kind of ordinary concerns. And I talked about that in the camp book with Penelope Pitstop. She does it as well, and I think it's a kind of thing that heroes tend to do in these kind of campy.
It's
Kind
almost
of
like that kind of
things.
stiff upper lipped British stoicism, which is,
Very much so.
for instance, in like Brief Encounter, like please help me to be sensible, and all that brilliant stuff. Which incidentally, I found out the other day that Celia Johnson is actually related to the Flemings, but that's by the by. But that kind of stiff upper lip British stoicism it's almost because it's so out of its time. I think that's probably why we find that I find that element of Bond really camp. It's probably the part of the Bond that I probably try to emulate. So if something really bad happens in real life, rather than just go, oh my God, I'll just kind of like try to keep it contained and go, well, that's going to be expensive. Something like that, which is, it's like, oh God, inside you're just dying and you're like, this is disastrous. But you try, and I think that's very camp about Bond.
It is. It is very British as well. I think that kind of not
Yeah.
showing it, and I think it's a thing that kind of I did as a child when in situations where I was being picked last football and trying to just not show that you're upset about it, just by making some little quip or something to kind of get out of the situation, to not show you care. So I think there was a power in doing it, but I think it's something that as maybe a nation or maybe the world doesn't do as much as it used to. I think we're much more now kind of we're expected to be authentic and to get very emotional very quickly when things go wrong and sort of show our emotions a lot. Whereas Bond is the opposite. Bond's not about showing emotions.
No.
He's about keeping things quiet. One thing I will mention, in partly it's why I didn't write about Bond in this book, is that the next book I'm doing is about language and masculinity, and I want to have Bond on the front cover of the book. I'm just in talks with publishers about getting the right photo. And I've done a bit of an analysis. I got all of the Bond. I think are there 12 books, 12 Bond books?
12 novels and then 2 books of short stories. Yeah.
Yeah. So I got them all, put them through a computer. This is the kind of analysis that I do when I'm not writing about
corpus linguistics. Yeah.
Corpus linguistics. Yeah. And then I was kind of looking for words and phrases that relate to Bond's use of language in the books, in the novels. And one 3-word phrase comes up the most often, and it's Bond said nothing. And that occurs 13 times across the books. It's the most frequent phrase which directly relates to Bond.
I didn't know that.
And because I was expecting it wouldn't be something like that. I was expecting them to say something like "shut up, girl" or something, or to say something in a certain way. But it's not. It's actually the books are a lot about him not speaking, about him using silence in order to, I suppose, convey a presence or a masculinity. And that kind of makes sense in a way. I think they're action films. You don't expect him to be chatty and to have conversation. I mean, he's actually not a very good conversationalist, I guess. From my perspective,
Fleming himself said that James Bond is someone things happen to, rather than him being. So all of this talking, in gender and cinema and literature around narrative agency that characters have. Actually, if you look at Bond's agent, Bond is not a particularly active agent. In the books, a lot of the time, things happen to him.
Yeah.
And he kind of nudges things rather than actually actively does things. And I think that's reflected in the way that he talks a lot of the time. James Bond is actually quite a good listener. He will actually take on board everything people are saying. So yeah, I know he kind of has this reputation of being taciturn, and that kind of ties in with masculinity and stoicism, but that goes right back to Fleming, who didn't want Bond always voicing what was going on in his head. But that's the brilliant thing about the books, because you can kind of see what's going on in his head.
Yeah. And I think it's just that exaggerated masculinity where he doesn't have to talk. He shows power with silence. And there's a wonderful bit, I think in Diamonds Are Forever, there's a scene where he's actually, it starts with Bond Said Nothing, and it's a bit where he's on a date with Tiffany Case, I think. And they barely speak for the whole of this date. And then
Yeah.
sort of they get back to the hotel and they're in the lift and she says, "Fifth floor, please." And he doesn't say anything to the kind of elevator guy, even though he's not on the fifth floor. And she gets out and then he just follows her and doesn't even say, like, "I'm going to come to bed with you." And she
Wow.
kind of goes down the corridor and he follows her down. And there's kind of assumption in his silence that he's going to have sex with her, and she'll let him. And then she gets to the door of her hotel room and she kind of turns on him. She has a speech prepared and then she can't do it and she just kisses him instead. And he wins and he gets what he wants just by saying nothing whatsoever. So there's not even an attempt at seduction. It's just his silence is just, "I'm going to have you and I'm not even going to say I'm going to have you and you're going to accept it."
Which is sort of camp, I suppose, in the sense that, you know, would it be acting against type for that sort of character?
I think it's exaggerated masculinity. It's that sense of entitlement that you would expect a certain type of man to have, I think. And I think possibly now it's even worse than it would appear maybe in the 60s when the book, or the 50s when that book was written. Maybe that was seen as more acceptable, but now it just seems so over the top, I think, that someone would act like that. I mean, it would look like stalking almost, you know, kind of following somebody down a corridor.
Yeah. One thing that the books don't have really are bad girls. So in the sense of, you know, they are the villains. So they were an innovation really for the films, which I always find those characters a massive kind of locus for camp. So Fiona Volpe, the flame-haired vixen, literally her name Volpe means, you know, fox. She's this flame-haired character who rides a motorbike that fires rocket launchers out of it. And then you've got a sort of similar character called Fatima Blush. I mean, just the name alone.
The names. Who comes up with these names? Are these names in the books, or do they make the names of the films?
None of these names are in the books. I mean, Pussy Galore is there in the books. And there's a few other choice ones as well. But
Plenty O'Toole.
Plenty O'Toole is not in the books. No, sorry.
What about Chew Me?
Chew Me is when you actually see them in the cold light of day like this, it's like, oh god, out of context of the film, isn't it? But you've got obviously probably on a par with Pussy Galore, you've got Xenia Onatop from Goldeneye, which and then so she's kind of all three of those characters, Fiona, Fatima, and Xenia, I think are really brilliantly queer characters. And then you've got the only time we've actually had a main villain who's a woman is Electra King in The World Is Not Enough. And she's brilliantly camp as well. I mean, Sophie Marceau plays her so brilliantly without letting on that it's so over the top. And I think they are some of my favorite characters. I know a lot of other queer viewers of Bond, particularly gay guys, love those characters, and I think it's probably because they kind of have even though they're the villains, they're a sort of oppressed minority, you know, women, and we identify, not a minority, but they're an oppressed group, and we identify with those figures. So I think there's lots of other examples in your book of those sorts of women who have suffered as well. And you point out people like Judy Garland. I wrote a whole thing about Skyfall being a version of Wizard of Oz. So as I was reading that, I was like, oh, okay, I can kind of see that helps that fit even more, really. So do you think those characters stand out to you as camp?
Very much so. I think, yeah, and that there's that kind of potential identification. Whereas you've got Bond as the kind of normal heterosexual man, and then you've got the kind of you often don't have gay representation in the films, or if you do, those weird characters that don't occur very much. But then the Bond girls or the Bond female villains, if they're in there, or the ambiguous characters sometimes who start off bad then go good. I think for kind of gay men to watch those films, there's maybe a bit of vicarious identification.
I think so, yeah.
The same way maybe that you'd have with, say, a Betty Davis film or something.
Yes.
Or, in the past,
Yeah. So is there anything else? I think you mentioned the only other thing I remember you mentioning as we talked about this initially was layers and villains layers.
Yeah.
So what did you make of the layers? I'll admit it's not something that I'd really thought about too much in relation to camp, so I'm really interested to know what you thought.
Well, I think there's nearly always a layer, and
yeah,
and they're often so huge
Yeah.
and sort of, you just think, how can they be hidden away and sort of not someone not stumble across them? There was one in the volcano, I think, and then, or they're
Yeah.
underground, or they're on the moon or
That's
something.
like the ultimate. That's, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, if you
but
were to have a lair, hollow out a volcano, stick a rocket launcher pad in there. Yeah, great.
they remind me of business class lounges in airports a bit, I think, because they're so big, and then they're
Mm.
often quite stylized as well, quite stylish, I guess, as well. And then you've got these little buggies that people can travel on monorails in them as well, I think. And that reminds me of being in airports where you can see people kind of going around on these little buggies. Um, and 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 then there's usually a bit where he's kind of given a cocktail, or there's a kind of pond or something with like killer fish in it or something as well. And a lot of business class lounges sometimes have water features. I was kind of going from South Korea and stopped over at, I think, Dubai, and in a business class lounge there recently, and it just felt like I was in a Bond lair the whole time I was there.
I know what
Um,
you mean. They're almost very corporate in the sense of you can almost imagine behind the scenes the bureaucracy involved with keeping the volcano lair running. Like you can imagine who's in charge, who's HR, because they've got an absolute nightmare whenever someone gets thrown in the piranha pit. It's like, oh my God, how many forms do I have to fill in now? And some of the later films actually play into that a little bit. So I don't know if you noticed in Diamonds Are Forever, one of my favorite bits of Diamonds Are Forever, and it must have been done intentionally because it's a set. It wasn't a real oil rig that they used for the interiors. I mean, the fact that they're on an oil rig is brilliantly. People think the end of Diamonds Forever is rubbish because an oil rig, it's not very exotic. But I
mm,
love the fact they're on an oil rig because it's not very exotic. It's like the worst place. And then you've got this big sign in the background which says, "If you don't know, ask." So it's like the health and safety team in the oil rig have put this massive sign up, and it's accompanied by a shot of the doctor who's been lulled into thinking he's going to win a Nobel Prize, but he's going to end the world instead, saying to Blofeld, what are we doing here? And it's this massive sign above him. It's like, I don't know how anyone doesn't find that scene. Well, I think a lot of people don't like Diamonds Are Forever and that version of Blofeld played by Charles Gray because it kind of does give the game away, and it kind of,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, I really liked it, and I
yeah,
thought the theme tune was one of the darkest, most
yeah.
depressing songs when you listen to the lyrics, where it's about a woman who's basically,
Given up on men.
yeah, the diamonds won't leave her. They linger not like men. It's such a depressing song to start off with,
Well, the
but
fact
they,
that you do know the story behind that song, don't you, Paul?
no,
She's not talking about diamonds.
who is she talking about, or what is she
When
talking about?
Shirley Bassey asked John Barry, what she was like, I don't understand the song. Why am I talking about diamonds? So John Barry said, so don't talk about diamonds as if they're diamonds. Talk about diamonds as if they're penises.
Oh, well, it's a whole new level of camp that I didn't even know was in that
So
song.
I'll refer
Thank
you to the line, touch it, stroke it, and undress it. And I'll leave it there
you.
for you to reevaluate Diamonds Are Forever
I
the
have to
next
go and
time.
listen to it right now
If you
again.
want the best version, in my opinion, apart from the Arctic Monkeys, which is brilliant because they kind of take away some of its kind of glamour, and I love it. But there's a version by David McCalmont and David Arnold. So you've got and in the video, both of them wear quite feminine kind of
Mm.
attire. David McCalmont's a gay man as well, but the video for it, if you watch it on YouTube, is dripping with camp. It's absolutely brilliant. So I'm not gonna
Brilliant.
spoil that.
I love it.